In this video, we'll start looking at how you verify trigonometric identities. So in the last section, we looked at very simple trigonometric identities and worked with how to use them. Now, quite often what will happen is that you'll come across a rather complicated looking trigonometric expression or um, um, or will be given some sort of thing which is claimed to be an identity, and we want to verify that it in fact is true. So let's start with sort of a simple example. Let's say that we have the identity given to us is that 4 secant of y cosine of y equals 4. And what our job here is to make sure that this identity is in fact true, namely that the equals that's in between these two things is not incorrect. And the way that we want to do that, there's lots of techniques algebraically, is to basically simplify or use simple trig identities in order to turn one side of this equation into the other side. Now, my rule of thumb with these is actually to start with the more complicated side. So here 4 sec y cosine y is clearly more complicated of an expression than 4. And so that's actually the better place to start because there's a lot that we could do here. For example, what do we know about cosine versus, say, secant? Well, if we think for a second, we remember, oh, well, secant is 1 over cosine. So I could write the left-hand side as 4 1 over cosine times cosine of y. And then we've got cosine over cosine. We can just cancel those, and what's left is 4. And that's exactly the right-hand side of the original expression. So that verifies this identity. Now this is a very simple one, right? Because the only trick we had to pull was to say secant is 1 over cosine. Very straightforward. But sometimes it's not quite so obvious. So let's take one that's a bit more fun. 7 cosine of x plus 7 sine x tan x. It's claimed that this is the same as 7 secant of x. This is not nearly as obvious. So again, I would prefer to start with the more complicated expression here. And there's a lot of different things that we could do with this. So for example, what about if we just said, well, what is tangent here? It's sine over cosine. So why don't we try working with it from that point of view? So 7 cos x plus 7 sine x times sine x over cos x. Well, here I've got sine squared over cosine. And at this point, I noticed that this term is a fraction and this first term isn't. So if I want to put these two things together, maybe I could do it with a common denominator. And so in that case, the first one becomes cos squared over cos. And then the second one just stays the same. And then I can factor a bunch of stuff out, so I can write this as 7 over cos x times cos squared x plus sine squared of x. And because we looked at this in the last section, cos squared of x plus sine squared of x is always equal to 1. And so we get 7 over cos x. Division by cos x is the same as secant. Okay, so that's one way that you could have gone about doing this. Another way, and this is the way that the WebAssign exercise sort of intends to do something like this. In some of these exercises, they give a sort of suggestion of approach, sort of a scaffolding. And so let's look at how we would do it using their scaffolding. So we start with the left-hand side. And then what they've noticed is that we could, for example, factor a division by cosine out of both of these. And if I do that, and let's also pull the 7 out while we're at it. If I pull a division by cosine out of a cosine, then I get a cosine squared x. And then they have a blank here. And if we think about it for a minute, because the cosine in the denominator we pulled out of this tangent, that leaves the sine that's in the numerator of tangent to buddy up with this one. And so what needs to go here is sine squared of x. And then at this stage, we know, of course, that sine squared plus cosine squared is 1, and so this is 7 over cos x, and that, as we said a minute ago, is 7 secant of x. So there are sometimes multiple ways to kind of get started with these things, and for some of these exercises on WebAssign, they're giving you sort of a scaffolding. So here they gave us that they wanted it to be of the form 7 over cos x times some brackets, and then the cosine squared was there, and there's a blank here where we put the sine squared, and so that part of the answer would be sine squared. And then in the next step, the blank was there, and so they're kind of giving you the framework, and then you just have to fill in the little pieces to kind of get the hang of how this can go. But as you see here above, sometimes there's more than one way to get at the answer. Which one of these is more complicated or easier? I'm not sure. The second way was probably a little bit easier because they'd kind of given away what the trick was. But there's more than one way to do it.